This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. If you are joining us on YouTube, you should know that this program is also available on your favorite podcast platform. This talk is our second talk with James Shapiro, who really needs no introduction. Jim is Larry Miller Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2023, he was awarded the Baillie Gifford Winner of Winners Award for Best Work of Nonfiction in the history of the award. This for his book, 1599. This talk will focus on Jim's most recent book entitled The Playbook, a story of theater, democracy, and a culture war. This work has been described as a brilliant and daring account of a culture war over the place of theater in American democracy in the 1930s. This series has been maintained with support from the Aoyama Gakuin Institute of the Humanities and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Jim, thank you so much for returning to our little series here.
My pleasure.
Your recently released book, again, is entitled The Playbook, a story of theater, democracy, and the making of a culture war. And yes, there is double meaning in the short title, The Playbook. You have gifted us once again with another superb study, and once again with an American history, the tragical history of the life and death of the Federal Theater Project. Now, the Federal Theater Project was, as you will soon explain in more detail, a Depression-era initiative meant to establish a people's theater in an effort that failed only because it succeeded so well and caught the attention of the wrong politicians. Though Shakespeare is not the focus of this book, we know that as goes theater, so goes Shakespeare and the converse, and Shakespeare does make significant appearances throughout. The story here that you call from myriad sources forms into a real-life drama with its heroes and villains reflecting the best and the worst sides of our national character. So may I ask you to give us an overview of your book and let our viewers and listeners know what they can expect?
Sure. Thank you for that kind introduction. I should say that most of those watching and listening are familiar with my work on Shakespeare's London, the London of 1599, the London of 1606. Those two books took me a quarter century to research and write. And then in 2016, Donald Trump was elected. And I realized that my laser-like focus on the politics and culture of Shakespeare's London and Shakespeare's England was misplaced, that I had taken my eye off the ball and I had too little sense of theater and politics and Shakespeare in the United States. And I should say that when I was going to graduate school, any graduate student suggesting to an advisor a dissertation on any American theme in Shakespeare would have been shown the door. It just wasn't done. We were all Anglophiles in those days.
Yeah.
So I embarked at that point on what I now understand to be a kind of trilogy. The first book was Shakespeare in a Divided America that looked at everything from revolutionary times to the present. The second is The Playbook. And the third, which I hope we get to spend a few minutes on, is a biography of a fictional character, Othello, for Yale University Press's new Black Lives series.
Excellent.
So the Federal Theater. Federal Theater was something I knew almost nothing about. And I should say that I've been working for the past dozen years or so as a Shakespeare scholar in residence at the Public Theater in New York, which to a very large extent, as I now understand, was modeled on the Federal Theater. Let me give you a very brief sense of what the Federal Theater was. Between 1935 and 1939, very brief period in the nation's history, thanks to a WPA program that was seen through by President Roosevelt, a number of art initiatives were created and funded by the federal government. theater was one, music another, painting, writing, even historical research. These were extraordinary programs. In its brief life, the Federal Theater mounted 1,000 productions in close to 30 states, seen by 1 out of every 4 Americans, most of whom, audience surveys showed, had never seen a play in their lives. And they saw these plays either for nothing or for a pittance. And this was an extraordinary, innovative, and for many, life-saving or career-saving enterprise.
Mhm.
Arthur Miller got a start in the Federal Theater. Orson Welles got his start in the Federal Theater. But most of the people who worked for the Federal Theater were out of work actors and vaudevillians. Most New York theaters during the Depression, and this was a Depression era theater, most of those theaters were dark. And across the country in the previous 30 years, movies had almost completely erased a thriving theater culture. And the Federal Theater was meant in a way to arrest that, to give jobs to the thousands of actors and directors and stagehands who are now out of work, and also to point the way forward for a more vibrant American democracy. And I could not imagine, looking forward from 1935, how exciting that must have felt.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Uh, the thing is, all across the board, even when you go to the right-wing conservative politicians, we'll get to in just a second, everybody had some experience with theater, right? And Mr. Dies, Martin Dies, who is the villain in this story, or one of them, and I was taken by the fact that he studied drama in college, and of course oratory and so forth. And yet, when they get to these hearings, and I'll ask you a little bit about these hearings, you start there. That when he forms the uh, precursor to the HUAC committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, that is so famous, uh, he goes straight into a right-wing line, and everyone in this questioning seems to be absolutely naive about theater in maybe ways that were disingenuous, but you chart that out. And Hallie Flanagan's this heroic figure who established the institutional structure for this theater was an enormous mammoth project to do. And it just seems impossible from the start, yet she did it. She has to testify along with others. And I would like to go into just a rough overview of that history, how things started falling apart with this committee looking for communists and fascists at the same time.
The Federal Theater was created by Roosevelt and overseen by Harry Hopkins, one of his brilliant, hardworking supporters, aides, politicians. Hopkins had gone to Grinnell College and he had befriended Hallie Flanagan in Iowa. She was a Midwesterner.
Mm.
And it was a challenge to find the right individual to oversee as massive an enterprise as the one we're talking about. She had a lot of things going for her. After teaching at Grinnell, she had moved to Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, and had created a really vibrant theater world there. She had studied briefly at Harvard's theater program and excelled there. And she was one of the first women to win a Guggenheim Award. And that sent her through all the European capitals in the 1920s to study what cutting edge theater was, including going to the Soviet Union, which was doing a lot of agitprop theater, but theater on a large scale, taking theater very seriously. She came back, put all that into practice at Vassar, but was clearly ambitious and wanted more of a career than was available to her. And had the Federal Theater not come along, she probably would have remained a beloved, charismatic theater professor at Vassar, mounting spectacular productions on a low budget. Harry Hopkins remembered her from Vassar. Most of the egotistical directors he interviewed for the job of director of the Federal Theater were impossible to deal with, and he asked Hallie Flanagan to lead this. She took a pay cut from Vassar and took on this enormous responsibility. And there is, like many a Shakespeare plot, heroes and villains in this story. Hallie Flanagan is clearly one of the great heroes, and I'm a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and they've asked its members to think about those from the past who've been overlooked that should be posthumously included. And I've recently put in Hallie Flanagan's name and hope she does get that honor many, many, many decades later. Uh, at the beginning of the project, it was clear to her that you can't stage a play without acknowledging the belief systems, the politics of the actors and directors and everybody else involved. Almost all of these productions were inoffensive. They ranged from Christmas plays to recycled classics from the Greeks on down to modern European drama. But one of the innovative art forms of the Federal Theater was something called the living newspaper.
Yeah.
And kind of based on newsreels of the time, the challenge they faced, unlike the challenges theaters now face, is you couldn't put on a play with 4 actors or 8 actors and employ enough people who were on the payroll of the Federal Theater and the US government. So they had to devise plays that had casts of 150 or 200 individuals. And the living newspapers would stage plays about pressing contemporary issues, substandard housing, the rise of fascism, syphilis, socialized medicine, utilities, farming. Now, these may not sound thrilling to Broadway audiences, but to the average Joe and Jane in the 1930s, suffering from the cruelties imposed by the Depression and the Dust Bowl and the like, these were thrilling plays, and they were written by top-rate playwrights. And of course, they landed squarely in the middle of a political divide in the United States.
Yeah, yeah. It amazed me when I was looking at how brutal sometimes the press was towards these plays. They're using an entirely different critical standard that was just absolutely ignored by most of the people, apparently, who went to these plays and felt that they were seeing their own lives in reflection.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And this was a theater in a way by Americans, for Americans, and everybody involved, except for a handful of people surrounding Hallie Flanagan, were unemployed. So the goal of the Federal Theater, in a sense, was to get them back working in the private sector, and some of the best actors moved from the Federal Theater back into the commercial theater. But what quickly emerged was these plays, like many plays, like most of Shakespeare's plays in his own day, touched on sensitive political issues. And at the same time as Hallie Flanagan's meteoric rise to the pinnacle of theater in America in the 30s, at the same time as this, a little-known congressman from the second congressional district in East Texas, near the Louisiana border, a young man named Martin Dies, whose father, Martin Dies, had been a congressman at the turn of the century, decided to run for office. And he made it to Congress. He was one of the youngest members of Congress, 31 years old. He lied a bit. He told everybody he was 30. He lied a bit quite often. And he couldn't find a way forward for his enormous ambitions. And you noted earlier that the title is a one that has a double meaning. It's both about the playbooks produced by the Federal Theater, and it is also about the current right-wing playbook, which we take for granted as somehow timeless, but was created by Martin Dies as a way to counteract and successfully destroy progressive enterprises. And I would describe the Federal Theater, like FDR's New Deal in general, as progressive. So much of my book is about the inexorable collision between Hallie Flanagan and the Federal Theater and Martin Dies, a congressman who is appointed the first chair of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And, we tend to think of Senator Joe McCarthy as the guy who started calling out communists and vilifying enemies and naming names. Not so. McCarthy actually called Martin Dies the greatest communist hunter of them all. Not that he ever led to the conviction of a single American as a communist, nor was it illegal to be a member of the Communist Party in the 1930s. And the Federal Theater was legally restricted from asking individuals of their political orientation. Nonetheless, my book is about the collision of these two forces and obviously its implications for our current political scene.
Yeah, I was struck by the fact that, for instance, Hallie Flanagan and the people working there, they seem to have very pure motives, if you call it that. They saw theater as entertaining. We love it. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with giving people things they love, with having those kinds of communities that stretched over not just maybe working class type people, but church groups, civic clubs, Rotary people. I'm sure this was part of their infrastructure. Somebody could help, apply, use their own existing in smaller towns, not in the big towns, and put on a play, have some resources to do that. And so these are genuine. And then you have Dies, who starts out as a populist, a spokesman for the working classes. And then he just can't find any traction there. And once he goes on anti-communist and starts getting to that dialogue, he starts to feel things gearing up a bit and just goes in whole hog, of course, with his incredibly, it's just hard to read, some of the quotations you pulled out, some of his quotations and others, because race is a big issue in here too. Perhaps
Race is a central theme. Martin
yeah,
Dies was an unreconstructed bigot
yeah,
who ran on a campaign that vilified the only Black congressman in the country. And he represented a good old boy district where Blacks were not allowed to vote. And even poor whites were restricted by poll taxes from voting. So
yeah,
he'd be elected by a tiny, tiny number of constituents. And it was pretty horrifying learning this, but also for me, eye-opening insofar as I was able to see in slow motion, in a way, the emergence of a culture war that had such profound implications for our culture wars today. Most people think that our culture wars began in the 1990s,
mhm,
and there was a spate of books, all with
yeah,
that same title.
yeah,
But we've always had culture wars going back to revolutionary times where some people loved the British and some people wanted them gone.
yeah,
But the culture war over theater in the 1930s, to me, is especially notable and worth spending years of my life researching, in part because one of the things that I understand is going back to ancient Greece, theater and democracy were twin born in that moment. And you cannot have a strong democracy without a thriving theater, and you can't have a thriving theater without a strong democracy. And as we speak now on the verge of an election, it's quite frightening to me what the implications for both theater and democracy
Yeah.
will be.
Yeah. Yes. It surprises me um, how much documentation really you have for how much people understood the importance of theater. Yet at one and the same time, people are asked to justify the importance. And if it slips away when you have to come up with reasons, but then everybody knows it. And you do march into some clear-cut examples. The early failures, of course, it had to be. You're throwing something together, and it looks to me to be weeks and months and performances. You're trying to go national, and of course, you start with the larger cities, what New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, that sort of thing. And but finally, they hit it with Macbeth. They get something, and they even get the papers, the press behind them. I think on this production.
The Federal Theater needed a hit. They were created in 1935. It takes a while it wasn't until November that everybody who wanted to sign up for it could sign up. Only a couple of months left to 1935 at that point. The newspapers are saying this is a boondoggle. We haven't seen a single play yet. And in fact, the first plays did not come out until 1936. And one of the first major plays that was going to be shown in a Broadway theater was called Ethiopia. And it was
Yeah.
one of those living newspapers. And it fell afoul of the State Department because it showed a criticism of Haile Selassie's defense of his country against Mussolini's invading troops. And the US at that time was a neutral on Italy invading an African nation. And they told Hallie Flanagan, shut it down.
Mhm.
And a number of people who were working on that production quit, and she was just stuck. And they made a terrible mistake by putting in a in that theater, which was dark, a play about the president of the Confederacy, in which you have a scene in which somebody formerly enslaved begs to be enslaved again. And Hallie Flanagan writes in a diary, "This is a disaster," and I would have panned it myself.
It was
So
Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was at the yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Very very
that play
difficult
was
guy.
meant for the South. And
Yeah.
again, this is a theater that's speaking to, they're doing plays in multiple languages for the immigrant communities in the United States. And I should say that theater had, and we're not sufficiently, and I was not sufficiently aware of this, between 1910 and 1935, theater just died
Yeah.
in this country, and the
Yeah.
movies just took over. And when the Federal Theater went to Nebraska, which had a thriving theater community in the 19th century, people waited outside the stage door to see whether this was a movie or those actors were real.
Hmm.
And that's just heartbreaking.
It's
So it was it's a very sad story to write. I love doing research. People who know my work know that that's what I enjoy the most. And the research for this was made possible by a couple of things. One, Hallie Flanagan's papers were collected and available to me both at Vassar and at the New York Public Library. But the Federal Theater was a government program, and the government saves every scrap of paper. And the confrontations in Congress, which I hope we can get to,
yeah.
are also part of the congressional record. So I was able to draw on actual conversations and embarrassing statements about Marlowe and others, which we'll
Yeah.
also get to.
Yeah.
And what really made this possible was, yes, the federal government collected all this documentation and all these hundreds of playbooks, but they stored them in a place that was forgotten. And it wasn't until a couple of scholars from George Mason University in the 1970s went hunting for these and found these large wooden crates covered with pigeon droppings in an abandoned airport in suburban Maryland, that we had all this extraordinary material brought back to light that scholars have been able to draw upon.
Yeah, well, there's many examples of people on the committee not knowing really what they not knowing what they're talking about. They didn't do any research of the plays. They would extract quotations. It would be something just this isn't in the book, but well, who said neither a borrower nor a lender be? Isn't that anti-capitalist? And you don't put it into context of the old fool Polonius and the play. Did William Shakespeare say that? But even more absurd was, is Marlowe a communist? And
Yeah, well, that's one of the great lines and a chapter title in the book. In November 1938, Martin Dies, head of what everybody called the Dies Committee, but was officially the House Un-American Activities Committee. He called in Hallie Flanagan, and for the first and probably only time in American history, the place of theater in American democracy was hotly debated.
yeah,
And as you said earlier, Martin Dies studied oratory. He was an actor in school along the way, spectacular performer,
yeah,
charismatic, knew how to manipulate the media, knew how to work emerging media like radio and newsreel. He had figured out the playbook of the far right extremely well.
mhm,
And seated at the end of the table from him and his committee was Hallie Flanagan, who had come in
yeah,
to defend the federal theater. And this 4 or 5 hours of heated exchanges produced one of the most memorable ones when, let me see if I can get the exact quotation. I have a pretty good paraphrase of it. In an essay that Hallie Flanagan had written about left-wing theater for a theater magazine, she had talked about the Marlowe-esque tendencies of this theater.
yeah,
And one of the congressmen jumped on this and demanded to know, who is this Marlowe? Is he a communist? And the room exploded in laughter because back then people still read Dr. Faustus.
sure,
And even Flanagan, to her, she had tremendous self-control, but even she was smiling. And he insisted again on asking who Marlowe was. And she said, the next great Shakespeare, a dramatist after Shakespeare in the Elizabethan days.
yeah,
And it turned up in his obituary decades later. He never lived that down. I think it was Joe Starnes
yeah,
who said that. I may be wrong, but this was the gist of that committee. They knew nothing
yeah,
about theater. All
yeah,
they knew was this: their mission. Um, Given to them as a short-term investigative congressional committee
yeah,
was to spend 7 months investigating Nazism and communism and fascism and their rising tide in the United States. And they had no interest in this. They were right-wing to begin with, and they went after low-hanging fruit.
yeah,
And it was a collision between two government entities. One was going to survive, and one was not. And uh, Dies understood that this committee would give him tremendous power, and it did, and give him tremendous American popularity. He's one of the most popular people in the United States. One of the earliest Gallup polls asked people what they thought. Should we renew the Dies show? And three-quarters of people said absolutely, because they were riveted by the newspaper coverage of this.
yeah,
And he understood that, and he decided to go after low-hanging fruit. And that
yeah,
low-hanging was relief. And the major relief program that was vulnerable was theater. And
yeah.
he made it business to destroy the federal theater. And we have been a weaker democracy ever since.
When I was reading that, I just thought if you could have gotten the members of that committee out for a very fine production of Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine the Great, Part One only, they may have come away saying, "Oh, I kind of like
You
this.
know, Orson Welles
Yeah,
directed and starred in a WPA Federal Theater production of Dr. Faustus.
yeah,
Had they gone to that,
yeah,
they would have
yeah,
understood what the Marlowe-esque was. They were not interested in the actualities of theater. They were interested in what they were really interested in was tagging all of theater. And Euripides came up and they asked Hallie Flanagan, is Euripides interested in class conflict? Is Euripides a communist, basically? And she tried to explain to them what many of us try to explain to our students in introduction to drama classes, which is great drama, including Shakespeare's, is about the collision of competing points of view and voices.
yeah,
Antigone is pitted against Creon. We all know this. They wanted to cherry pick and they would pull out lines from plays without understanding the contexts in which those lines were spoken. And they used them to vilify the public theater as left wing, as communist, which it was not.
yeah,
It was progressive, but you couldn't attack something for being progressive in an America where Roosevelt and his progressivism was enormously popular. And the House Un-American Activities Committee was supposed to end in January 1939. It lasted until 1975.
yeah, yeah.
And in 1939, the Federal Theater was shuttered and those crates sent off into the ether.
Yeah, I think just below the surface, it didn't surface as much in official hearings, but you quote a number of cases. Right there's race. And I think maybe there was this extreme fear that uh, were Black people able to somehow find the Venn diagram, the overlap that they had with the working classes, and these people say, "Listen, can we settle our differences here just for the benefits of our family, to feed them, and so forth?" That really would have been something that these right wingers would have had trouble dealing with.
Well, you mentioned the production of Macbeth in early 1936. It opened. It had a cast of 150 Black actors. It
Yeah,
opened at the Lafayette Theater in New York. It was the first great hit of the Federal Theater. It moved to Broadway. It made the reputations of its effectively producer, John Houseman, and of course of its director, Orson Welles, who had just turned 20 and not directed anything until this point except for school productions. And we tend to call this the voodoo Macbeth, and I think that's the wrong name for it, although it did substitute for Scottish witchcraft, Haitian voodoo, since it was set in 19th century Haiti. But what we tend not to focus on is the national tour of that production, and I write about this, that followed. It's one thing to stage a Black production of Macbeth in Harlem, and whites from downtown flocked to see this. It was a huge, huge mega hit. And by the time it was done, something like 100,000 or more people had seen the show. But they decided to take it on the road with a special train that could hold this cast of 150 or so and the stagehands. And they went to various cities, some in Jim Crow America.
yeah,
And it was the hardest thing to find a place for these actors to sleep in these towns, which were still discriminatory. Some places wouldn't allow them to play. And they ended up in Martin Dies's own Texas for the Dallas Centennial.
yeah,
And here you had Black actors doing Shakespeare in racist Jim Crow Texas. And that must have been something. Not very well received there, but the marker was put down.
yeah, yeah. Well, there was so much more that you went into with this misnamed Voodoo Macbeth. I think that's how it's known. I mean, I heard of it before, and of course, very famous, and it's Orson Welles, and the problems they had with that. But it must have been a spectacular show, in my imagination, and And of course, Orson Welles didn't come out looking very pretty. He was very much the taskmaster as director, and there were some problems with his thinking. He had to, I don't know, there's some disingenuousness in there. The details sort of evade me, but having to go to the Gulf Coast to find people when there were people already available, that sort of thing. So there's the internal politics of the within the National Theater production.
You know, one of the things that was painful to read and write about in writing this book was, yes, you had white supremacists like Martin Dies and others in Congress, but even Hallie Flanagan and her progressive circle were uncomfortable with race. Hallie Flanagan did not want miscegenation, for example,
Right.
to be in any of the plays that she was staging. And one of the chapters of my book is about one of the most remarkable federal theater plays called Liberty Deferred, written by Abram Hill and John Silvera. And they were slow walked for 2 years as they continued to try to see this play come into production. And the reason why was it was a searing exposure of 2 centuries of American racism. And at this point, feeling the heat from Congress, I'm sure Hallie Flanagan and her subordinates realized we can do this, but it's going to be the end of the ride. And in retrospect, it was the end of the ride anyway, and they might have brought this voice into American culture many, many, many years, 90 years before the Black Lives Matter movement. So there were
Yeah.
voices that were developed but never heard because of the federal theater. And I write about that as well.
Yeah. Well, she got some heat the other side of the progressive left. And there was a feeling among you bring out among members of the Harlem Renaissance that we know, canonized figures like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, who were both very involved in the theater scene. Um, and there's a later title here, the Liberty Deferred, and it reminded me of Hughes's Dream Deferred poem, like a
Absolutely.
raisin in the sun. And Lorraine Hansberry picks up on that title. There's a sub-history here that maybe not, it's not as taught. It was taught when I was in school. And it's fascinating. But there were some criticism coming from Black intellectuals and artists in Harlem about some of these things. And I guess that goes with the turf. If you're out there doing something, you're going to have all kinds of reactions.
You are, and it wasn't only from the Black community, which was really justified in a lot of their complaints,
Yeah.
but also from those further to the left, initially involved in the federal theater, who left because they couldn't really pull it further towards what might be seen as communist.
Hmm.
And for me, I'm a progressive, and I'm watching as progressive initiatives today are weakened by criticism from those further left who don't see
Yeah.
it going far enough and seeing it as a sellout,
Yeah.
and weakening the progressive enterprise just enough so that the right comes and destroys it. So these
Yeah.
are Pyrrhic theories.
Oh, I felt this
And
very strongly in recent years. It's come back in some ways. The critic,
it has. And
Gerald, yeah,
I'm hoping that the book is a kind of allegory that people will read both as a way of understanding and combating the Republican right-wing playbook. And also, I harbor no fantasies of a return of the federal theater in my lifetime, but this would be a much, much healthier country had a federal theater developed and had people had access to plays that were about the concerns that Americans in their daily lives felt.
yeah, yeah. Well, you have it as a kind of sandwich in the sense that we start out with the Dice Committee and with Flanagan's defense, and then we go into some examples of dramas, the How Long Brethren, One Third of a Nation, which is a very class-oriented, working class-oriented story, one third of a nation. That's stunning, liberty deferred. And then you go back to Dies and his creation and the kind of rise and fall of that whole thing, because in some ways they both fell, even though it was picked up by McCarthy et alia. The uh, the story there, this is a sad story. There is sadness here in the midst of all this
There is,
potential.
and to me, that sadness is even more pronounced because of what was innovative about it. Not simply interracial casting and pushing boundaries in that way, but take one of the stories I tell of a Sinclair Lewis novel that was dumped by Hollywood for being anti-Nazi in the 1930s and staged by the Federal Theater in 18 states, in 21 theaters, opening the same night and different in each locale.
Uh-huh.
Kind of like the movies, but
Uh-huh.
it wasn't uniform. So there were innovative things about the theater which had never been reproduced in America
Yeah.
and might have been a template for even a more innovative, more chance-taking theater than we see today.
Yeah, and that's the Sherwood Anderson. It can't happen here, right? That's how we feel. I think as Americans, it just this will not happen here, but
It's happening.
it's kind of happening right now. It's not funny, but yeah, I felt along with you, kind of traumatized over the past few years, more so than I remember being even during the Bush years and those horrible conflicts they jumped into, and then before that, but uh, the the thing is towards the end, and we can return to any portion of this book to look at it again, but toward the end, you have an epilogue after the end of the Federal Theater, how it ended, the sadness that beset Flanagan's life. She became very ill and felt like a failure. Dies. You wonder, both of them got very ill in different ways, and you wonder if this is, I don't know. I teach Shakespeare. I'm not a doctor, but you wonder if the intensity of all of this just pulled everything out, and it was needless. It was absolutely needless. Both people could have gone on their way and had careers and not engaged in such a way um, to I think, hurt themselves. It ended up, she was hurt by him, but he had to feel it, and along with all the other hatred that he espoused. I'm not sure how much these people really felt it. They just knew if they said it, they could get those votes from that base, right?
Yes. And and again, the outcome of that has had reverberations because when the National Endowment for the Arts was created, the Heritage Foundation trotted out all of Martin Dye's arguments in an attempt to end it under Reagan. Even now, there are attempts in Congress to zero out the budget line for the NEA. And no less disturbingly, and I end the book with this, high school productions are now being targeted
Oh
in the
yeah.
United
Oh yeah.
States. And when you read how in Florida, Romeo and Juliet can only be taught in snippets,
Yeah.
it makes you feel what began in the 30s is still working its way through our political system today.
Yeah. Yeah. In some ways could be even stronger because media is so immediate and so ubiquitous that it worries me. It worries me when you go after Midsummer Night's Dream. That's a hard one to to see as subversive. Uh, and yeah, the just a few months ago, I got on my whatever news feed, Representative Cotton of Arkansas grilling the TikTok CEO, and your playbook came to my mind later when I read your book. I'm going, have you ever been a member of the Chinese Communist Party? Do you have a Chinese passport? And this guy's, he said, I'm from Singapore. I'm not Chinese, I'm Singaporean. And, we could discuss whether or not any big service like that has the right to take our personal information and misuse it or whatnot, or that they may misuse it and be suspicious of that. But it's almost like he just saw the movies that we saw or read whatever we read, and uh, it's almost like you see the movie Spartacus and you pull for the Romans. Like he goes, "Okay, I want to be that guy. I want to be the McCarthy type guy." To
Yeah, and you cite Tom Cotton. One of the things that up and coming aggressive members of Congress recognized and capitalized after Martin Dies's hearings was we can string together the titles of federal theater plays, the Beau's Stratagem, the Widow's Tears, whatever it is,
yeah,
and make jokes about them. And Senator Everett Dirksen and others all stood up in the Senate and in the House and just read titles aloud to the mocking and sneering responses of their colleagues. And
yeah,
that's as low as Congress gets.
yeah, yeah. That is. I remember some years ago, every year when the Modern Language Association would have their convention, there would be a reporter who would go in there and cherry pick, admittedly kind of absurd titles, that always,
Absolutely.
and then print those and say, well, we got these people in town. And it's just so misrepresentative of what that group was there to do and
Yeah, but
the
this
bulk of
this
things.
is where it started, and it's important
Yeah.
to know the roots of where this way of responding to creative change occurred in the United States.
Yeah. Well, there's so much we've talked about some of this. We have only scratched the surface. This book drills down into some detail. The testimonies themselves are dramatic. Everything about this book is dramatic. When you're dealing with individual dramas, but also the testimony, you really, really strung together the strategies that went into what people were saying, what they maybe should have said at the time but didn't, or mistakes that they made or didn't make in these. And it's fascinating stuff. But this is part of a trilogy. As you mentioned before, and we are very eager to see what the next project is. This is on Othello.
It is. I was approached by I keep thinking I've said my piece about Shakespeare in America, and then new doors open up.
Yeah,
And I hope it's not a tetralogy, but simply a trilogy. But Skip Gates and David Blight of Harvard and Yale have just gotten together and are overseeing a new series called Black Lives at
mhm,
Yale. Yale had long had a Jewish Lives series. They thought now is a good time to have a Black Lives series.
mhm,
And I had written extensively about Othello in my book on Shakespeare in America. They had liked that. And they asked me to write a biography of a fictional character. I've never written a biography before. There are biographical elements in the playbook, but that's a little different. And I'm used to thinking up my own ideas rather than somebody pitching me on a book project. And I thought, you know what, this could be fun. I would restrict it to Othello's American life.
yeah,
And I said to Skip Gates, uh, obviously, you're asking an old white guy from Brooklyn to do this, and I don't know if I'm the right person
yeah,
to be asked to do this. And he was pretty insistent about not deciding based on ethnicity or anything else, race, who gets to write about what. And that gave me the confidence to sign a contract and begin what I think will take me another 3 years to complete, which is from the early slave ships sailing out of Newport named
yeah,
Othello, uh, which had a slave revolt on it, up through some of the stories I've told before, but the great Othellos, Ira Aldrich, Paul Robeson, and much history besides. And it's really been rich pivoting from the playbook to uh, this material. And I hope I do it justice.
Well, I'm certain that you will, and even beyond Othello and his otherness, being Moorish, being black in a obviously a whiter society that recognized him as other, but also admired his capabilities. Uh, Even beyond that dynamic, which is fascinating, how you import that into a country that's so entrenched in racism and slavery and Jim Crow and everything else. It's got to be fascinating. Uh, and then there's the rest of the play. There's Iago, and there are all of the moral complications of that play, the collision between the culture of Othello and the culture of the Venetian Senate, and what their expectations are, and then the Turkish fleet, all kinds of things that I could see how it might take 3 years.
You know, I love teaching that stuff,
Yeah.
and that's not going to be in the book. I've decided let a different series, the History of Villainy series, do Iago. Toni Morrison has written a brilliant book on Desdemona.
Yeah.
I'm really focusing on Othello,
Yeah.
and I guess I'll leave you with the thought. We think of our founding fathers and their values. How does the fact that Ben Franklin named a slave boy of his Othello make us think about him?
Ah, okay. Well, a wise choice, I think, because there's enough material there. I know that you
Too
went into
much.
this in Shakespeare in a Divided America. You were talking about the productions and so forth, but the one that I remember is Ulysses S. Grant. I remember that the best. But you're not starting out from scratch, and this will be something. Well, I wonder what our prospects are for the future. I would like to think that there would be, and just kind of in closing, I guess, uh, it wasn't all sad because you saw people of extraordinary sensibility, and Hallie Flanagan being, a Midwesterner, a woman in that time in particular, having to sit in front of these cigar smoking good old boys. I mean, you can think the worst kind of real smoke filled room, coming at her and holding her own. And the heroic nature of that, and also the people who got involved in it so enthusiastically, into these productions, and how quickly it was working, and it was successful. And one would hope that somebody would be able to do that again. Uh,
Well, great enterprises are few and far apart. And I have to say, on a more modest level, the Shakespeare world, your series is one that I never miss. And you have figured out how to pull together older and younger and diverse voices in this series. And it is going to be, I'm sure, 100 years from now at the Folger Shakespeare Library, the most consulted database, if you will, these conversations to understand Shakespeare at our moment. So I'm grateful to you for that.
thank you so much. Coming from you, that means quite a lot. I'm just hoping
Very true.
we can keep it going. We have to secure funding, and this is not commercial. This is done out of essentially the goodness of the hearts of people who are interested in maintaining this kind of thing. And I think we'll be able to go at least one more year, I hope, and I hope further, and we'll see.
Well, I'm counting on coming back in 3 years, so you better still be in business
Oh,
then.
you can come back anytime you wish. Anything that comes out. Jim, I can't express again how much we appreciate your contributions, but also your support of the program. It means so much. And there are a lot of struggling young scholars out there that it really benefits everybody when someone of your reputation comes on. And so I would like to ask you to stay a little bit after we finish, but for right now, thank you so very much for joining us.
My pleasure.